There is a moment that happens to a surprising number of people, a moment that arrives quietly without fanfare, after years of discipline and sacrifice and careful saving, when they finally see six figures in their bank account for the first time. And instead of feeling the relief they expected, instead of feeling the arrival they had imagined for so long, they feel almost nothing. And sometimes they feel something closer to anxiety than celebration, because the number that once lived in their mind as a finish line is now sitting right in front of them. And it turns out it looks a lot smaller in real life than it ever did in the imagination. This experience is more common than financial culture typically acknowledges, and it points to something important, not about the person feeling it, but about the system that shaped their expectations in the first place. $100,000 is, by almost any global measure, a significant accumulation of wealth. And yet for a wide segment of people living in developed economies, particularly in high cost of living urban environments, it produces a psychological response that feels more like treading water than standing on solid ground. And understanding why that gap exists between the number and the feeling is one of the more clarifying exercises in financial education. The starting point is what behavioral economists call reference dependence, which is the well-documented tendency of the human mind to evaluate financial positions not in absolute terms, but relative to anchors. And those anchors are almost always set by the environment, rather than by the individual. When someone has spent years seeing housing prices quoted in the hundreds of thousands, when they watch retirement projections casually recommend accumulating $1 or $2 million, when their monthly cost of living alone consumes several $1,000s before any savings occur, the mind quietly recalibrates what a large number means, and $100,000 begins to feel like a number that exists inside the margin of error rather than above it. The math supports this feeling more than most people are comfortable admitting. If a person lives in a major metropolitan area with average monthly expenses somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000, which is not an extravagant lifestyle in cities like London, New York, Toronto, or Sydney, then $100,000 represents roughly 2 to 3 years of basic living expenses with no income. And while that is genuinely meaningful as an emergency buffer, it begins to feel less like wealth and more like a temporary shield against a system that requires constant financial participation just to remain stable. When you calculate that a modest home in many of those same cities requires a down payment somewhere between $60,000 and $150,000 just to begin the mortgage process, $100,000 stops feeling like an achievement and starts feeling like a prerequisite. What makes this particularly interesting from a systemic perspective is that the threshold at which money begins to behave differently, the point at which it starts generating meaningful returns rather than simply sitting as a buffer, is considerably higher than $100,000 in modern economic conditions, with inflation running at rates that frequently outpace low-risk savings instruments, with index fund returns requiring time horizons of a decade or more to smooth out volatility, and with the compounding mathematics of wealth requiring a certain critical mass before the curve begins to steepen meaningfully. $100,000 sits in an awkward psychological zone, large enough to feel like it should change things, but not yet large enough for the mathematics of passive accumulation to noticeably accelerate. This is the threshold illusion in its most precise form, and it was not designed by any single person or institution, but it emerged from a confluence of factors that include how financial goals are culturally framed, how media represents wealth, how consumer infrastructure has expanded to absorb income at every level, and how the mathematics of modern asset prices have shifted the goalposts of financial stability further into the future than previous generations experienced. Someone who accumulated $100,000 in 1985 was sitting on roughly $280,000 in today's purchasing power, which represents a meaningfully different psychological and practical reality than the same number sitting in a 2024 account. And yet the cultural weight attached to the six-figure milestone has not fully updated to reflect that shift. What changes on the other side of understanding this is not the number itself, but the relationship a person builds with milestones in general, because the deeper insight is that no single threshold, not $100,000, not $500,000, not $1 million, carries the emotional and practical weight that financial culture tends to assign to it in size.